to Rainy Day Rabbit Holes, a uniquely Pacific Northwest podcast. I'm Shea.
I'm Jody.
Let's fall down the rabbit hole. Well, hi, Jody.
Hi, Shea.
Happy Sunday.
Ooh, yes.
You know what?
It's a beautiful day.
I know
too.
it is. It's gorgeous. It is the beginning of October. Obviously, when you hear this, it'll be the end of October. But for us, it's October 1st. And it's definitely fall.
Definitely fall. A beautiful fall day.
Yeah, it's gorgeous today. Super sunny, nice and cold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like it.
Brisk.
I like it.
Thinking about finally getting rid of my front porch summer decor and putting up my fall.
Oh,
I'm very resistant. Very resistant.
I've had my fall stuff up since Labor Day.
Yeah. No, not me. I'm like, I won't give up on summer. I won't.
No. Yeah, and I'm really excited because I'm only a week away from my big trip to Japan.
Ooh, it's so exciting.
Yeah. So by the time you guys are hearing this, I'll be back from Japan and I'll be getting ready to tell you all about the trip and how Japan and Washington State are intertwined. But for now, yeah, I'm going to be there for 16 days with my big brother. And I'm super excited.
I'm excited for you. I can't wait to hear how it goes. I know you've been looking forward to it for a long time, practicing your Japanese.
Yeah, I study my Japanese every day. And so it's been basically in the making for 4 years. I think we originally bought our plane tickets we had planned on going in October of 2020, and we bought our tickets for that in December of 2019. And then, obviously had to cancel the trip. And so we rebought the tickets this past December. So, yeah.
Long time coming.
Yeah, I've been waiting for 10 months.
I didn't realize that it had been 4 years of planning.
4 years, yeah.
Wow.
So just waiting for Japan to open. And it only reopened a year ago.
Wow.
So
were they one of the last?
Yeah. Yeah, they were really resistant to it. Well, friends, I know that you guys were expecting this episode to be the wrap up of our Rainy Day Rabbit Holes road trip. So starting with day 3 and taking us down the rest of the Northern California coast to San Francisco. But we decided not to release that episode. While we enjoyed talking about it, when we re-listened, it was very boring.
It was really boring.
Yeah.
And we may have had like a negative attitude because we did a lot of crap talking in that one. I was like, oh my goodness.
And that was definitely like after a long day of work, and both of our energy was pretty low, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell we were just like, yeah. And then we did some stuff.
Yeah. And then we were looking forward to getting home.
Yeah, basically.
That's pretty much a wrap up of that episode.
I mean, in a nutshell, we drove through a redwood forest. That was really cool. We drove it to San Francisco. We did some stuff in San Francisco, and we flew home, and that was the rest of the trip. Mm-hmm. You haven't missed anything.
Mm-hmm. No.
So the things that I found in San Francisco that I thought that would be something I would want to do a rabbit hole on was the Coit Tower and Palace of the Fine Arts. But honestly, it would have been a short episode because there's not a whole lot that's really interesting. It's just kind of some history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what I ended up falling down the rabbit hole on, in part due to my dad, because I was like, hey, Dad, be my research assistant. Start finding out cool stuff about San Francisco for me. And he turned me on to some stories about Chinatown and the history of Chinatown. And so I started researching more and more about Chinatown. And I found some really, really interesting things about the history of Chinatown. So I'm going to share with you some Chinatown history that I think that most people will not be aware of. And definitely will make you think differently next time you visit San Francisco's Chinatown.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Yeah.
So when was Chinatown established in San Francisco?
Well, it was during the gold rush. So
1848.
Okay. Yeah, 1848. I think just in the 1850s, over 25,000 people immigrated to San Francisco from China.
Wow.
So, yeah,
That's a big chunk.
It was a big chunk. So
is it one of the first established in the country, or is it one of the oldest Chinatown?
I think it is one of the older ones. I know Chicago and New York both have big Chinatowns as well, but this is I think definitely one of the most densely populated ones. So you ready to get into this?
I'm ready.
Okay. All right. By the way, for everybody out there who's like, San Francisco isn't part of the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. And I'm like, okay, I know parts of Northern California are considered parts of the Pacific Northwest, and San Francisco somehow falls right out of that, but I don't care. This is our podcast. We can do whatever the fuck we want.
That's right. If you want to include San Francisco, include San Francisco.
Exactly.
I mean, I think we saw one definition that included it, didn't we? Or did they just say Northern California?
They said parts of Northern California,
Gotcha.
but then when I looked into it, they're like, oh, nope, the Bay Area is part of its own thing.
Oh, gotcha. All right.
It's part of the Bay Area, but hey, you know what? They're our neighbors, and we were there.
We were there.
So anyways, I got a lot of my information from PBS and the History Channel, and I will eventually put the full list of all of our sources on our website. I just haven't had time to do that yet. So that'll get put up before the end of the year. If you do actually want specifically sources before I do that, you can email us and I can send them to you. But for right now, just know that we have our sources. We will publish them. But for now, it was mostly the PBS and the History Channel and this great film by the American Experience from PBS. It was called Plague at Golden Gate.
Plague
at Golden Gate, which I was like, huh?
And this was a disease?
Well,
or was this what we're going to talk about today?
This is what we're going to talk about.
Gotcha.
All right. You ready?
Gotcha.
Let's do it. Okay. In the early morning of June 28th, 1899, an Italian fisherman discovered two bodies floating face down in San Francisco Bay. A Japanese steamship had arrived the day before from Hong Kong after stopping in Shanghai, Yokohama, Japan, and Honolulu. She flew a yellow flag, which was the international symbol indicating disease. Two stowaways who were apparently ill jumped into the water and died and were later found. Medical personnel thought there was something odd about the bodies, and they sent them to Joseph Kinyoun, who was the nation's foremost plague authority, and his lab was out on Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay, which I could do a whole rabbit hole about Angel Island as well.
We almost went there.
So Angel Island had a quarantine station and a marine hospital. It was also the immigration station for San Francisco. So kind of like Ellis Island is for New York, Angel Island was for the West Coast.
Exactly how Jackie described it to us.
So John Kinyoun already knew that hospitals around the world were reporting the plague had a 90% death rate and that millions had already died from this pandemic that had been raging since the 1850s. So I'm going to do a little...
And where are we now? 1899. So
1899.
This is, 40-something years of...
So a little history about the plague. I think most people are familiar with the Black Death, which was the first known wave of the bubonic plague that swept across Europe in the 1300s. It took about 4 years to make its way from Central Asia to Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And in Europe alone, it killed an estimated 2/3 of the population.
Yeah, it was devastating.
Though scholars do think that perhaps deaths from other disease like smallpox and leprosy also were attributed to the bubonic plague. So remember, it was
misdiagnosed.
Olden times. Yeah, there was a lot of misdiagnosis that they thought. So anyways, so that number, who knows how accurate the number is. So interestingly, some of the public health measures that we implement today, like during this last COVID-19 pandemic, emerged during the Black Death. And that's like isolation of sick people and their families, restricting ships to port, and the control of movement of people and goods. So that actually started in the 1300s to try to control the spread of the bubonic plague. So the second wave of the plague was in the 1500s, and it saw the emergence of a new strain that was much more virulent. Is that the word I'm looking for? And it hit France the hardest, killing 2.5 million people between 1600 and 1670. And it also hit Holland, Italy, and England in the 1500s.
And is that because it seemed to have traveled faster? Is that because we were traveling faster?
I think yes, because I mean, at that time they didn't know how the disease was transmitted. It has been for centuries considered a disease of bad air or uncleanliness, or as you'll hear in this story, attributed to a particular race.
Oh, gotcha.
So, they didn't know how the transmission happened. So outbreaks would still happen in small pockets, but it started declining in the 1700s. And the last great epidemic was in France in 1720 and in Russia in 1770. So it was pretty quiet from the 1770s until the mid 1800s. The next pandemic wave beginning in 1865 in southern China. So between 1894 and 1929, there were over 24,000 cases in just Hong Kong alone. And from Hong Kong, it spread into the ports of India, where 12 million people died over 20 years.
Wow. 12 million. That's over 20 years. Now, when you're calling
India.
we're talking about the plague here and these other phases. Now, the bubonic plague, is this the same related virus?
It's bacteria.
Oh, it's bacteria. Okay.
Yeah. The bubonic plague is bacteria, and we'll get into transmission in a little bit here.
And these are all still related?
Yeah.
These plagues? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, because, old-timey.
Gotcha.
Old-timey disclaimer here. So it was not until 1897 that the bacterium that caused the disease was identified. And in 1898, the mechanism for transmission was discovered. There was also a vaccine created in 1896, but it only had about 50% protection, and it had terrible side effects. I mean, we're talking like within hours of being injected, it would feel like you were having a heart attack and your whole body would be on fire. And it only offered 50% protection. So people were really reluctant to take the vaccine. People were already really reluctant to take any vaccines at that time anyway. Especially vaccines that are killed vaccine or even a live vaccine. They're like, what, you want to inject me with the disease?
Right. We don't typically see vaccines for bacteria either.
Yeah. So back to San Francisco in 1899. Dr. Kenyun had some understanding that perhaps the plague was associated with rats. So he had that Japanese steamboat disinfected. He quarantined the passengers and crew on Angel Island. So he thought that the 2 dead men had died of plague, but the bodies were they were in bad shape, so he couldn't because of the condition of the bodies. So he could not say for sure that this was the plague. But he stayed alert because he suspected it was. San Francisco was the busiest coast or the busiest port in the West Coast, and it was beginning to be connected by rail all over the country. So in 1862, I think, was when the big, huge rail project was happening that was connecting all of these American cities. So it was perfectly positioned to spread the disease throughout the country.
Right.
Joseph was really concerned about that, so he became diligent about inspecting all ships from Asia because it was thought that this disease was a disease that was only affecting Asians. And so you could contain the disease by containing Asians.
Wow.
So let's pause the plague here, and we're going to get a little bit into the history of Chinatown. So in the mid-1840s, China itself was suffering. They had just been defeated by Britain in the First Opium War, and the Opium Wars were these 2 armed conflicts between Western countries, Britain and France, and China. And they were mostly about Western powers wanting unfettered access to Asia. So for their markets and their products, and especially opium. And after this defeat and these treaties that were forced upon them, there was a series of natural catastrophes resulting in widespread famine, uprisings, and just terrible living conditions. So when the news of the American gold rush came to China, a lot of people decided to take their chances at getting their fortune in America. So like I had said before, so that was approximately 1848. So around 25,000 people came to America in the 1950s alone. So that was a pretty big influx.
1850s?
In the 1850s. Mm-hmm. Did I say the 1950s? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was a big influx of Chinese and other Asian immigrants into America at that
time. For the gold rush. So we had them coming across the country and also coming into the country.
Right. Mm-hmm. To, do a lot of labor mining and then eventually go on to really be a big part of building the railroad.
So were they coming over to stake their own claim, or were they coming over to work with other?
Yes, I think a lot of them were coming. Well, some of them were coming just for labor, and some of them were coming trying to stake their own claim. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, white Americans were having a problem with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also, unfortunately, by the time many of the immigrants managed to actually reach San Francisco, the gold rush was starting to die out. They had already mined most of the gold that was available. So many people had already come to stake their claim that there was nothing left. Many of these immigrants had to turn to just hard labor to survive. Right. And those who weren't working in the mines, maybe they'd go into farm labor or they'd work in the garment industry, which was a big thing in San Francisco in the late 1800s.
What a risk to take, because it's not like you could go, oh, that didn't work out, I'm going to go home. It's not that easy.
Right. And a lot of these people had to take loans out to even get to America. So they were in debt when they got here. And we'll get into that a little bit too. More became railroad laborers, as we know about some of the terrible tragedies that have happened in building the railroad and on the immigrants that would be killed in these really unsafe working conditions. But they were instrumental in building that railroad that connected San Francisco to the rest of the country. In addition, Due to protests by the white miners that foreign miners were cutting into their profits, in 1850, California passed a foreign miners tax that required miners who were not U.S. citizens to pay $20 every month for the right to mine in the state. What is that in today's money?
$20 in 1850 is equivalent. It has equivalent purchase power right now to $787.25.
Holy crap!
So they would have to pay almost $800
in order to
for
labor.
our reference point in order to just labor, just to work there, or
Just
to take
for
gold.
the right to mine.
The right to
so
mine.
even to work as a miner, you had to pay that tax.
Even if you're working for someone else and they were taking the profit. Wow.
And also remember, these foreign immigrants are being paid less than their white counterparts. So they're getting paid the lowest wages.
Wow.
So, it was almost impossible. There were a lot of protests, and eventually it was dropped to $4, which is still,
That's a
I'm sure,
significant
a lot
drop.
of money. And in reality, the tax was only collected from the Chinese. There were a lot of other immigrants. The European miners were not forced to pay it. So mostly Chinese and Latino miners were forced to pay that tax, but not the Europeans because, they were white.
Correct. Yes.
So as in the case with many immigrant communities, things were really tough. So most of these Chinese immigrants had to work for reduced wages and work longer hours than their white counterparts, of course. Many women were forced into sex work, either for survival or they were just straight out kidnapped and trafficked.
And these women would be family members of the men that came to mine? Or are these women that came to mine?
No, I think the women that would come over might come with their families, or some women came just in the hopes of finding a better life for themselves because things were so bad back home. So they came over here hoping that they could get a job, maybe in the garment industry, and that maybe they could find a husband here as well. Maybe another Chinese immigrant who would come here.
So they'd heard about the American dream even in the 1850s.
And they'd come over here and either couldn't get a job, couldn't make it work, and so had to go into survival sex work, or were straight up forced into sexual slavery. And many people, like I had said, went into debt for their transport to America from China. And a lot of those loans were given out by tongs. And tongs was just kind of a word for a local association that would offer loans and also would offer protection. And they were really benevolent at the beginning. They were there to offer help to Chinese immigrants for helping them maybe get money to fight discrimination, or these loans, or just protect them from, a lot of white people that wanted to beat them up, basically, and harm them physically. And it was one of the few resources that the immigrants could turn to in these difficult times. But eventually, these groups incorporated sex work, gambling, drug trade, and racketeering, and they became the preeminent Asian gang organized crime network in America.
So were they charging for the protection?
Yes.
And so power and money.
Yes. And so eventually
took
they
over.
were running the opium dens that were a big thing. There were opium dens in China, and a lot of the laborers who came over here were addicted to opium. And so this was an opportunity for the Tongs to open up opium dens in Chinatown and continue that trade. And they were operating gambling halls, bars, brothels, and those opium dens. And I was going to go into a whole thing about the Tongs, but it would have taken out another hour and a half.
That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
It's a whole nother rabbit hole. Read about the Tong Wars. It's really interesting. But just to say, they started out benevolent and then turned into more of a gang organized crime organization. As these racial tensions grew between the white workers and the Chinese immigrants, they were forced into a much smaller and smaller area of San Francisco, which was later known as Chinatown. San Francisco's Chinatown held between 6 and 9% of San Francisco's total population in 12 blocks. And by 1890, Chinatown was home to an estimated 21,000 immigrants. It's a 12-block neighborhood.
What do you happen to know what the total population was?
Of San Francisco at the time? I do not.
Yeah.
I do not. So the American economy was starting to weaken at that time because the gold rush was petering out. And so many of the American workers, again, they thought that the Chinese workers were a threat to the American workforce. And so a bunch of racist legislation was passed to try to limit this perceived effect that the Chinese were having on the American economy. Okay, so in a nutshell, I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but there was legislation passed by California courts so that the Chinese could not testify against white defendants, same as Black people and Native Americans. So basically that legalized violence against these immigrants.
Right.
There was legislation passed that would fine you for living in squalid conditions. And then if you couldn't pay the fine, they would throw you in jail. And then because the jails got overcrowded, then they passed other legislation about cutting off the pigtails of Chinese men, which was a status symbol, to try to keep them out of jail. It was a mess. They closed the only segregated Chinese school, and they would not let Chinese children attend white schools. So, I mean,
they cut off all the education.
Yeah, they cut off education. They were poor and they had to live in squalid conditions, yet they were being fined for living in these squalid conditions. So the city was doing everything they could to drive Chinese immigrants out. And then in the worst two that were passed, I am going to go over briefly because they are very important, was the 1875 Page Act, which banned Asian women, specifically Chinese women, to come into the country because the United States thought that most Asian women coming here were all sex workers. Mm-hmm. And they were afraid also that Asian women would start marrying white men and contaminating the purity of the white race. So this meant that Chinese immigrants couldn't bring their families with them. And so they came here alone, and then men were outnumbering women 20-1, which increased the demand for sex trade.
Right.
So therefore, now women had to be trafficked more and more. So families would sometimes sell their daughters into sexual slavery, but also organizations like the Tongs were trafficking women from China here, promising them a good marriage or a good job, and then just forcing them to work as sex slaves in the brothels. It made sex trafficking terrible.
Right. It increased it.
Absolutely.
Because these men didn't have women that they would have relationships with. So
right.
Their needs
wife
were met
was back home. Yeah.
By that. So they actually increased, by stopping this awful sex trade work from the Chinese women, they increased this sex trade work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then probably one of the worst, most xenophobic pieces of legislation that America has ever passed was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all Chinese laborers from coming into the country for 10 years. You could only come into the country if you had obtained this certification, basically showing that you weren't a laborer. So it's limiting it to diplomats and maybe the very wealthy. Nobody could come. Also, if you returned to China, you could not come back.
Wow.
It was really, really bad. And they continued to extend it. So it ended up not being repealed until 1930.
1930.
Yeah.
And what an interesting time to have that happen, considering that would allow Chinese laborers back into the country, correct?
Right.
And we had an unemployment problem at that time.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And so what's also interesting, and I'm going to tie this in when I talk about Japan when I get back. One of the things that the Chinese Exclusion Act did in limiting that low-wage labor from coming here is it meant that other immigrants took that place. So I read at one point after that act was passed that the Japanese immigrants started to outnumber the Chinese immigrants. And that's one of the reasons why Seattle has such a huge Japanese community, is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, because they still had need for cheap labor, especially on the railroad. And so these other immigrants came in to fill that void. So that's an interesting tie-in there of how it affected other immigrant communities.
It's interesting to me that we clearly needed the immigrants to come do these jobs, but we just didn't want the Chinese to do it. Anybody else could do it, but just not the Chinese.
Yes. So, and the Chinese, it was, the xenophobia was just terrible. They considered them, of course, to be of a lower class of human, that they were all murderers, liars.
They dehumanized them.
They dehumanized them terribly.
And then you can easily make that jump, that legislation. You can easily treat people the way they were treated when you dehumanize.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll get to that right now, because all of this just set the scene.
Did I just accidentally make a segue?
You did. Nice job. Never ride a Segway, by the way. They're very dangerous.
Yes.
I think the inventor of the Segway died on a Segway,
I feel like
right?
he went off a cliff or something.
So all of that was to set the scene for how Americans thought of Chinese in the late 1800s. So when bubonic plague was first discovered in the U.S., that Chinese Exclusion Act was in full effect, but trade from China was still allowed because, of course, we're not going to restrict the movement of goods. It's part of the economy. And Chinatown was still a cramped, densely populated area. And at that time, there was very little sanitation. So there's no garbage pickup. The sewers are rudimentary at best. So
I'm picturing the smell. Oh,
yeah. There's not a whole lot of toilets. What do you do with your sewage? Not a whole lot of running water. People were so poor that they would sleep in beds in shifts with other people.
Hot racking.
Hot
That's
racking,
what they call it in the Navy.
That's
Hot
right.
racking.
Yeah. They would hot rack just because they couldn't afford it. So, and in fact, the first known death from bubonic plague in Chinatown was a worker who was hot racking with 3 other men in a hotel. And he died on March 6th of 1900. But however, back to Dr. Joseph Kinyoun, he could not officially confirm the diagnosis. One of the things that made it difficult to confirm bubonic plague at this time was an autopsy was needed to confirm it. And that was deeply against Chinese tradition to have an autopsy. Also, the sentiment against the Chinese meant that most Chinese could not get health care. If they went to the hospital, they would be turned away. And so they were unwilling to report sickness. So people would just die. They would take care of the body themselves, so you wouldn't know. So the actual cases of bubonic plague that happened this time were grossly unreported. So they think that it was many times more than what they actually came up with. Still, Joseph Kinyoun could not confirm bubonic plague. So, he works for the health board. He cannot, or not the health board, but it was the military health system or something like that. And they actually kind of had control over this sort of thing in San Francisco. But he couldn't confirm without this diagnosis. But the city board of health got wind of it. And so they panicked and they put a quarantine on Chinatown because, again, this is a disease that only affects Asians in their minds. And so they roped it off, and there were mobs of guards standing outside of the entrances to Chinatown with axes and guns.
Wow.
Ready to murder anybody that tried to leave. So, of course, there were riots. There was a lot of protests. They lifted the quarantine.
Who was rioting? Who was protesting?
The Chinese
Okay,
inside.
so within they were rioting and protesting. Okay.
And so they finally lifted that quarantine, but it had the result of undermining confidence in the authorities, not only on the case of the side of the Chinese, but the rest of San Francisco. They're like, oh, what are these crazy Board of Health people doing? We can't trust them. They put a quarantine on and then lift it. They must not know what they're doing.
Right.
Which will lead into the reason why this went on for so long. So Dr. Kinyoun was finally able to grow the bacteria and confirm that it was plague. And so he sent word to Washington, D.C., and they're like, contain it by any means. He told the leaders of San Francisco, but the city leaders and the merchant elite were really reluctant to A, believe him, and B, do anything about it because it would affect trade, right?
The economy. The economy. The ever most important economy.
Exactly.
Life or death.
And
economy wins.
Also, they were kind of unconcerned because, again, this is a disease that only affects the Chinese, right? So the white population, the important people, aren't going to be affected. If it kills some Chinese people, who cares? So focus shifted to just the Chinese. And these so-called Asiatic infections, and you see me doing air quotes here, were called a menace to public health by the mayor.
Menace.
So now you've dehumanized this population even more. So 75 health inspectors and dozens of police officers armed with axes, sledgehammers, and revolvers descended on Chinatown. They broke down doors. They smashed people's belongings. They stole whatever they wanted, and they would beat up anybody that stood in their way, and they would burn any belongings that they thought looked like they were quote unquote contaminated.
And this was to contain the plague? To
contain the plague, yeah. So their belongings were torched, and then they would burn sulfur smudge pots in all of the businesses and homes, which destroyed, if you had fabric or food, it would destroy it.
It smelled like a rotten egg.
And this had the effect of frightening the residents to the point where they were no longer going to report any sickness to the authorities.
Of course.
But 6 more cases anyway were confirmed by mid-May, and now white people were starting to get it.
Not white people?
including people that had never visited Chinatown. So then a plan was put into place to vaccinate all of Chinatown with that recently created, largely ineffective vaccine, and only 53 residents volunteered, and they reported the terrible side effects, and so nobody else decided they were going to do it.
How many?
53 people.
53 people. Okay.
So therefore, the Surgeon General decides that they're going to make it mandatory for all Asians
All Asians
to be vaccinated. And San Francisco decided that they wanted to try to keep any Asians from leaving the city. So they passed an order that transport companies, buses and ships and trains and whatnot could not sell tickets leaving the city or leaving California to Asians specifically. So riots ensued. There was a class action lawsuit filed, and a judge agreed that the ban should be lifted, and they blamed it on Dr. Kenyun that he was being overzealous, that he was overblowing the severity of this disease, and they put a restraining order against him from doing any more things. But he was like,
he can no longer make rules.
right. So but then he was like, fuck you, this is a terrible disease. I'm trying to keep it from spreading. And so he ignored the judge, and he continued to enforce containment measures and quarantine. Even to the point of forcibly removing people from their homes and when they've been exposed and placing them in quarantine on Angel Island. So he's villainized and heroized in this story in many ways. He obviously still was being kind of terrible in these measures, but he did have some scientific backing that
that's what I was thinking is
there.
So disregarding experts, making decisions for life and death based.
I can't drink out of the straw while I'm podcasting.
It's a metal straw. So basically disregarding experts and thinking we know better and going about and making decisions and silencing actual experts. This has been going on for a couple hundred years.
It's just the American way.
It's the American way. I know better. You don't know anything. I'm uneducated and you are an expert. So therefore I know the truth. You do not.
Yeah. So
and it just continues.
It's interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So his quarantines on Chinatown were eventually lifted by the courts. And then the next day, Dr. Kenyun decided he was going to quarantine the entire state. Oh. So, of course, all the white people were like, "What?
My
clutching their pearls.
My freedoms, my rights."
Exactly. Everybody else was outraged. So 3 days later, at this time it was President McKinley, had to apologize to the state and revoke the travel ban. So that was very embarrassing. So state officials were still refusing to acknowledge this outbreak. But by June of 1901, there had been 35 plague deaths confirmed. Now remember, there were a lot that were unconfirmed because people were not reporting the sickness to the health authorities. And so, it was obviously a lot more. So Kenyun at this point had been shuffled off to Detroit, and they brought in a replacement for him, Dr. Blue. And Dr. Blue actually did things a little bit different. He set up a lab in Chinatown, and he actually tried to get to know the residents. He hired Chinese translators, and he actually, get this, paid them the same as the white translators.
Was he allowed to do that?
I don't know. I
even
think,
legal?
Oh my God, how were there not riots in the streets by white people?
You must not have known.
So he revised these containment and plague containment measures. So he would only quarantine and disinfect homes that had been affected instead of like the entire town. Right? But then, and it seemed like it was working, but then 3 Japanese sex workers died of the plague. So then they were like, oh shit, now it's going to be impossible to trace the progress of this disease because, the sex workers will see dozens of people a day. And if they passed it on, then who knows where it could be. So he finally worked it out that white doctors throughout the city were purposefully misdiagnosing plague deaths so that they wouldn't have to report them.
So they'd say it wasn't the plague when they knew it was the plague.
Yeah. They wanted to downplay the seriousness of the outbreak. They think that there were hundreds more deaths that were just not reported of white people, too. So it was not just a Chinese disease. They wanted to keep it a Chinese disease. So they misdiagnosed on purpose because God forbid it gets out that white people can also catch this disease.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We wouldn't want to know the truth to protect ourselves. We'd rather live in this world where we don't need to protect ourselves, and it's all fine.
Yep. So at this
Reality's hard.
Exactly. So at this point, finally, the mode of transmission had been discovered. And so now Dr. Blue knew that it was the rats that were coming ashore from these international trade ships. They would come ashore, and when the rat dies, its fleas flee and go on to the next warm-blooded host, and they pass on the bacteria when they bite you. So they actually regurgitate a little bit into you when they bite you, and then so they're pushing the bubonic plague into you. And that's how it was spreading. So
And they didn't discover this till this outbreak of the plague that we're speaking of
I think it was.
Are we in the 1900s now?
We're in the 1900s now. The mode of transmission, I think, was first theorized in like 1898. I think it was actually in the Pasteur lab, and they discovered that that's the mode of transmission. But it's the late 1800s. It's not the age of the internet. News traveled slow. Plus, people still had a little bit of mistrust in science. So it was just easier to blame it on a certain race or
what I want it to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Not
in fact, the
the
Surgeon General of the United States at that time publicly said that he thought that it was a disease of the unwashed and unmoral.
Oh, so morality played in the plague. Oh.
And of course, Chinese were immoral.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
By being Chinese.
Exactly.
Well, they're breathing that air.
Exactly. Dr. Blue put into place a huge rat eradication campaign. So he actually offered a bounty for rats. So he would pay a certain amount per rat, and breeding females would get 10 cents.
Oh, wow.
So people were rounding up hundreds of thousands of rats and bringing them in. Now, I had to stop and think, okay, wait a minute. If you're killing the rat, those fleas are going to make their way onto you. So I think that there
was no like off or flea repellent or
no. They also started tearing down old dilapidated buildings that were kind of a breeding spot for rats and building new modern buildings, starting to work on some sanitation. And they did help slow the progress of the disease. So eventually there were no new cases reported. But then on April 18th, 1906, there was a massive earthquake that decimated the city. And because the water mains had ruptured, a fire spread out of control and burned down more than 80% of San Francisco. So they could not fight the fires because of that broken water main. And officials started putting off dynamite charges to try to make fire breaks. And it worked a little bit, but then troublemakers decided to just go into Chinatown and dynamite the whole town. So Chinatown was pretty much wiped out at that point.
And what year again?
1906.
1906.
Yeah. Most people were living in tents.
So the Chinatown we see today is definitely not the original.
No. Almost all of it is completely gone and completely rebuilt. Also, the city was handing out supplies to people, but wouldn't give any to the Chinese, of course. Yeah. Sewer mains had ruptured, and everybody was now living on the streets, basically.
Gosh.
So the rats came back. So the plague cases started to show up again. So by the fall, there were 30 more deaths. And at this time, doctors finally began to admit that they had seen bubonic plague deaths in their practices, but had not disclosed them. So the eradication of rats began again. And that it was then that they discovered that they knew about the fleas. So they started putting into place more sanitation measures. So garbage collection began because of this. And they rebuilt the sewage system so that it would actually take the sewer away, keep the rats below ground instead of in the buildings. And then they started to decline again. And they say in 1908, that was the last case, and San Francisco celebrated.
1908. So it just took a couple years.
Yeah.
After they started admitting it.
Right.
And addressing it.
So the plague was basically in San Francisco for 8 years.
Wow.
Yeah. But the government's denial and treatment of the outbreak left a known, remember this is known, 280 infected and at least 172 people dead, of which the majority were Chinese. Now, again, it was probably many more than that due to underreporting. So despite being vilified and targeted, Chinatown eventually bounced back. Organizations like the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association
Oh, wow. They like big words in that association.
They raise money to hire lawyers to fight back against the laws targeting the Chinese. And because the Chinese were refused healthcare in the city hospitals, they finally built the first Chinese hospital in Chinatown. And the community banded together to rebuild after the fire, eventually resulting in the beautiful, vibrant Chinatown that we walked through recently. However, racial discrimination and gentrification threatens the community of Chinatown. Tourists romanticize this exotic mystique of the city, and it has resulted in non-Chinese people that are not low income moving into the town, which is displacing the mostly low income population. And the impact of the pandemic and the recent scourge of anti-Asian hate and continued stereotyping is still having a detrimental effect on the neighborhood. I read an article by a man who grew up in Chinatown, and he was talking about what it was like to live there as a boy and have tourists come through and take pictures of him and his family like it was something exotic. He said they would just feel like you're part of the scenery for tourists, and fetishized in this false belief that Chinatown somehow represents authentic Chinese culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Like going to Chinatown now, I don't need to go to China. I've experienced it.
Right.
I'm good.
Right.
Yeah.
And most tourists who come to this neighborhood, including me, until I read up on this, have no inkling of the terrible acts of racism and discrimination that happened, committed by our own government to the people who lived here and to Chinese and other immigrants throughout the country. Like, I had no idea. I'd never heard of this before. It was somebody in my bar class that was like, you need to look into the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and how that affected Chinatown. And I was like, what the hell
Right.
is that? And I was just horrified. It was like the more I read, the worse it got.
Right.
And then when I saw this thing about the bubonic plague, during this time when you were literally not allowed to come here because you were Chinese, now also you're dying.
Right.
Well, if
you have no health care.
Well, you're dying in China too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're now, contained into this disease-ridden community where the plague is.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure if you were Chinese, you basically would not be allowed to live anywhere else in the city at that time.
And instead of, trying to help them, they were shamed and blamed.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Not only for bringing this disease, but for being immoral and living in squalid conditions. You were blamed for that, even though it was them who forced you into it in the first place.
Right.
And
we're going to create a situation where you now exist like this, and guess what? Now that's a crime and a problem.
Right. And I've only touched the surface of it. The more I read, the more of these just like terrible things that were happening to the immigrants kept coming up. And I was like, this is going to be a 2.5 hour episode if I keep going down every single little rabbit hole I found.
And blatant racist legislation. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, they didn't even try to hide it.
No, it was just...
They didn't even try to name it something nice.
Yep.
We are literally going to exclude you.
Yep. And, when you look at this and, this pandemic that came to San Francisco in the early 1900s, I mean, this was before the Spanish flu even. But some of the measures that were taken against that were reflected recently.
Oh, yeah.
And also, I think back to some legislation that was passed in the last 10 years banning people from certain countries to come here. That kind of reflects this. And it still is affecting immigrants from those affected countries now. I have a friend who married a man from Pakistan, and they've now been married for going on 3 years, and he's still working on getting his visa. And
he can't even come here?
Right.
Oh, wow.
They treated him and his wife, who lives here, like they were criminals when he's going through his interview for his visa.
And do you think that would be the same thing had he been coming from Norway?
No, absolutely not. They'd be like, oh, you're Norwegian? Great. That's awesome.
Come on over.
You guys are so cool.
Yeah.
No, I mean, they asked him specifically, I guess one of the immigration officers pulled him aside and was like, if you're lying about the reasons you got married, just leave now and we won't prosecute you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Very aggressive.
Yeah. Oh, very aggressive.
While you're just trying to be in love and build your family and future.
Yeah.
You're being accused of being a criminal.
They had a long distance relationship for years and then got married. So, like, they've been in a relationship for 5 or 6 years at this point. Like, come on. This is a long game if he's just doing this for a green card, right?
Right.
So it's kind of a travesty still. But, again, not to get into politics. Next time I go to a community like Chinatown, I feel like my eyes are opened a little more now.
Right.
I'm going to take a little more time to respect and honor what the people who founded that community went through instead of it just being, my own experience of the place at the time. Think a little bit more about the people who built the place and the people who still live there.
Right, right.
And just the strength of the people who built that community is really amazing. So that's my little rabbit hole into just a tiny drop of Chinatown's history. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Very political.
It is. It was a lot more than I thought I was going to find. The plague. So that pandemic of the plague also affected Honolulu's Chinatown. So I think most of that Chinatown got burnt down in 1900 because of the plague. So
as a way to contain it.
Right. So they were trying to burn down individual buildings and then the fire just got out of control and it wiped it out.
Gotcha.
So people just had to sit around and watch their homes and businesses burn to the ground. Yeah. And again, part of that was just because of racism, because this is considered a disease that only affects the Chinese or the Asians. Again, was that sentiment not reflected recently by
very much the whole time you were telling this
official calling it the China flu?
Yeah, the China virus. The entire time you were explaining your rabbit hole, I was thinking, wow, we are 200 years later behaving in the same way in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And then the waves of anti-Asian hate, which we saw
right after. I mean, it just followed right up.
Certain leaders were blaming COVID on the Chinese, so people decided that they needed to punish them for that.
Right. And sure, it originated out of China. Why and how doesn't matter, because the fella downtown in Chinatown didn't have anything to do with that.
Right.
So why are we assaulting these random Asian people throughout our communities?
Sure. However it happened. Yeah, I'm not going to speculate on where
that
it came
person
from.
Walking down the street
had nothing to do with it.
Nothing to do with it.
Besides having,
but it's an avenue to take out your frustration, anger, what's happening
fear.
to me. I have no fear.
Yeah, I mean, it's all fear, right? That's what a lot of it is fear. Fear of...
And we've dehumanized these people, so it's very easy to leap to, okay, I'm going to take it out on them.
Right. I fear this person because I've othered them, and so now I feel like I have to protect myself from them because I've othered them, and now they're a monster to me.
And they deserve
it. That's what othering do. Anytime you other somebody, it's easier to dehumanize them and then to justify acts of racism and hate
100%.
And violence.
That's how we get there.
So anyways, this was my kind of dark dive into
It was
Chinatown.
a dark dive.
Yeah.
I did not know all of that, and I'm more conscientious now than before.
Yes.
I always saw it as, a celebration of the Chinese culture, or we make space for them to have their own place for us to visit and get a taste of. That's actually not at all how that came to be or what it is.
Yeah. It was a place they were forced into and then terrorized in.
Right.
And then it was destroyed, and then they chose to rebuild. Now, one of the problems is when it was being rebuilt, a lot of wealthy whites decided that they wanted it in on it and would come and rebuild those buildings.
Gentrification.
Built by white architects in the style that they imagined was, I'm going to say the word, Oriental. I'm doing quotes right now. I'm using that word in the way that they would have thought. And it did actually have a pretty vibrant nightlife during, I think it was like the 70s and 80s. It was like there was a lot of cool clubs there. And now the white people were flocking to Chinatown because it was like the cool place to go because of all the nightlife.
Right.
And then that died down. And it's, it's seen as a big tourist attraction there, but 99% of the tourists wander through there with no idea of what has happened there.
Correct. That was me just
too, yeah.
a month ago when you and I went down there.
Yeah. You go there,
sure.
you have dim sum, you giggle at the weird stuff in the markets.
Right.
And wonder what all these roots are for, and take pictures of the lanterns, and then you move on without
thinking that you had just celebrated Chinese culture.
Right. So I feel a little bit educated. I know that I've only scratched the surface.
So today, now,
I'm not feeling virtuous at all by knowing this now or reporting it to you. Right. So this is not me virtual signaling or whatever in any way. This is just, I found out something that I've never known. And it also just enlightens me to the fact that we as Americans are not told the true history of things.
No, we are not.
Very rarely. What you learn in school is A, half incorrect. And B,
it's a rose-colored glasses.
It's rose-colored glasses, and it is exclusionary of any other cultures that have made America what it is today. Right. So there we go.
I think, yes, exactly. This is a great country that was built off the backs of hardworking folks, and sometimes those folks were doing that hard work against their will. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they were not treated well along the way. And I still think we're a great country, but I think you cannot be a great country until you admit to some of those things, because you check and adjust. We do this in our lives daily. If I'm going to, I set a goal at work or at home and I'm trying to achieve it, I have to, at the end of the day, once I achieve it, look back at how I got there and make sure that I don't hit the same errors that I did on my way to achieving that goal the next time I set a goal.
Sure.
And so while we're trying to make this great country, if we are not taking in the history that's negative or unflattering or hurtful, and we just kind of act like it never happened, we will continue to make those same mistakes, just like we saw. We're still doing some of the same things 200 years later, and that is why.
Yep. Was something I found really interesting in that PBS documentary, The Plague at the Golden Gate. They were highlighting that while they were passing the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, over on the other coast, we were building the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty.
Oh my gosh. At the same time, that is wow.
Which is now our symbol of the freedom and liberty of the United States and our inclusivity.
What does she say? Send us
you're like tired and poor, you're beleaguered. Is that word in there? I like that word. Beleaguered, tired and poor.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore.
Yeah, that was very ironic at the time. That here we are saying, here's what a great country we are, and then doing this over here.
Hypocritical.
Yep, very hypocritical. And, I'm still glad that I was born here, though
100%.
maybe my life would be better if I'd been born in Sweden, because apparently that's the best place to live. If you're a Swede, you won the lottery, man.
Yep, I've heard that multiple times.
Yeah, it was just ranked the number one country in the world for all these different metrics. And Japan was number 6.
Number 1 to live in?
Mm-hmm. 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 I think America was number 10. We're still in the top 10. But
I think people would be surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people assume we're number 1.
Well, that's just part of the American way. Mm-hmm. We're number 1. We're number 1.
Hey, I am all for tons of pride in where you live and your country, and I'm all for that. But being
aware of your country's shortcomings is important.
Right. If you are not aware of that, owning that, and working on that, you'll never be the greatest country.
Right. And
if you can't admit to those things and start addressing them, you will never be the greatest.
And knowing the history of your country is very important, whether it's good or bad. Because what's the saying? Something like, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. What's that saying?
Mm-hmm. It sounds
something
right
like that.
enough to me.
Yeah.
Close enough. The gist is there.
You have to be aware of where you've been wrong in the past, admit it, choose to do differently going forward, and you'll be better for it. So to hide that dark history, you're doing yourself a disservice. And I think it's important for people to know what horrible things have happened here. And it doesn't mean that you can't be proud to live here. You can't be proud of your country.
Right.
And I am glad I was born here, because it gave me so many more privileges than I would have been given if I'd been born somewhere else. I mean, I did win the lottery of being born here and born in the situation I was. I recognize that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've said that my whole life, how lucky I've been to be born here.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, everybody, every country, every nation, every ethnic group has done terrible things in their past. There's nobody that is free from having done terrible things to their fellow humans. It's those who do not learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. I think that's the saying. All right. Well, I think we've had enough for today. What do you think? Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate you, Jody, sitting here and listening to me give you my book report.
Wow. It was you. I could tell how much fun you had doing it. You were all in, you were very into that. I could see.
Yeah. Last Saturday.
I mean, I was too, but I could tell. I was watching the intrigue and joy come off of you across the way here.
Yeah. It was last Saturday? It was this week. It doesn't matter. I fell down this rabbit hole so hard that I had my headphones on. I was staring at the computer and I looked up and 5 hours had passed.
Holy cow.
And I was like, oh my God, no wonder my ass hurts and I have to pee.
Because I've been sitting on it and I have to pee.
I know, and it wasn't even done. So I had to go back yesterday and I had to cut myself off. I was about to go down the Tong Wars. And then I was like, okay, wait a minute. The Tongs go back to China in the 1800s. And I'm like, and then if we're talking about...
We're going to have to do a series if you go back there.
I know. Oh my God. And we're talking about like, it was the beginning of some of these Asian gangs that exist today. Yes. So it's like, what am I going to do? You know,
give it 300
years of history lesson. Like, okay, I gotta stat. So next episode, you get to hear our interview with Rick Viria.
Oh, I like it. You've been practicing.
I have been. The innkeeper of the Itty Bitty Inn, which you will have heard about in episode 1. So we had an interview with him. So you'll get to hear that next week.
He's an interesting guy.
Oh my God.
Lots of personality, lots of different interests.
Yes.
And he's definitely creative and thoughtful and smart.
Yes.
So it'll be a fun episode.
Yeah.
We had a great time interviewing him. So it'll be good.
It was really fun. And then you'll get to hear about Jody's Bigfoot journey. And after that, I will report back on my trip to Japan, which as of this recording has not yet happened, but I'm very excited. So,
yes.
So just
Lots
make sure
more to come.
Yeah. Subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts so that you can make sure that you can hear all those episodes.
Yep. And soon to come is our YouTube channel. You'll get to see some... something on there.
Yeah. As of this episode, I don't think I have time to do that too. But when I come back, by the end of the year, you'll actually get a real website. You'll get the YouTube channel. You'll get all that stuff. I don't know. We've thought about Twitter/X, but I don't know.
I don't think that's a good venue for us.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. I refuse to call it X.
I know, me too.
So stupid.
So dumb.
So dumb. But you can
Is it X Twitter? Is that
exactly.
the X is for?
Exactly. He loves X. Oh my God.
Why?
I don't know, because he's weird.
He's so weird.
He's so weird. All right, allegedly.
I don't know if it's alleged.
We didn't say his name.
I don't think anybody would say he's normal in any way.
No.
Fan or no fan.
Exactly. But you can go to Instagram and see our pictures of our episodes at Rainy Day Rat Holes Pod. And then if you want to email Jody any sexy Sasquatch art that you have made, please email her at jody@rainydayrabitholes.com.
Yes. Or if you want to send Shea any dim sum pictures that you've had at your local Chinatown, you can email her at shay@rainydayrabitholes.com.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will see you next time. Thank you guys so much for supporting us. We really appreciate it.
See you down the rabbit hole.